Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. On the first day of December 2025, a single remark, quiet, disciplined, almost bureaucratic, slipped into the pages of the Financial Times and altered the philosophical landscape of European security. Admiral Giuseppe Cabodrone suggested that a preemptive strike could, under certain hybrid conditions, be understood not as aggression but as an act of defense. It was delivered in the sterile language of military logic, but its implications were seismic. This was not merely a rhetorical escalation directed at Moscow. It was the deliberate redrawing of a frontier that has anchored global stability for nearly 8 decades. For years, NATO has lived inside a shadowed field of ambiguity. Russia's hybrid operations, covert sabotage, cyber intrusions into hospitals and energy systems, psychological warfare waged through disinformation have gradually eroded the distinction between peace and conflict. These actions never burst through the legal threshold of open war, yet they never cease. They create what many officials describe as permanent low-level aggression, a condition in which Europe is forced to live with continuous strategic discomfort. In such a world, the traditional doctrine of response begins to feel obsolete. Deterrence shifts almost imperceptibly toward anticipation. This shift, however, is not merely tactical, it is philosophical. By stretching the definition of self-defense to include first strikes, NATO collapses the moral wall that separates preventive war from legitimate defense. It weakens the core principle of the United Nations Charter, the prohibition of force except in clear cases of attack, and it sends a subtle invitation to future planners on both sides. Perhaps the unthinkable can be made respectable if we clothe it in the language of risk mitigation. The irony is devastating. A doctrine introduced to shield Europe from hybrid unpredictability risks, intensifying the very instability it seeks to contain. When preemption is elevated to the same moral rank as defense, the strategic environment no longer stabilizes around norms, it destabilizes around fears. Yet this evolution is not accidental. It emerges from an alliance under pressure, politically, psychologically, and institutionally. After years of cyber crises, energy blackmail, and the grinding war in Ukraine, NATO's threshold for caution has thinned. A Europe long anchored in predictability now finds itself untethered from the assurances that once held conflict at bay. A doctrine of restraint is replaced by a doctrine of suspicion. The belief in warning time dissolves into anxiety. Thus, the Admiral's remark symbolizes more than policy drift. It is the confession of a continent that no longer trusts the future to bring clarity. And when a civilization loses its faith in predictability, it begins to reinterpret preemption not as a breach of peace, but as its final guardian. To understand why NATO would publicly flirt with the language of preemption, one must look beyond Moscow and examine the political psyche of Europe itself. A doctrine is rarely born from pure strategy. More often it emerges from the quiet pressure of domestic anxieties, electoral calculations, bureaucratic incentives, and the psychological need of governments to project certainty in uncertain times. NATO's increasingly assertive tone is no exception. Across the continent, the public has been conditioned by a decade of narratives portraying Russia as an omnipresent, shape-shifting threat. Cyber attacks on hospitals, intrusions on energy grids, mysterious explosions at critical infrastructure, and the persistent carnage in Ukraine have created a political environment in which caution is associated not with wisdom, but with weakness. Leaders who speak the language of restraint risk being labeled naive or worse, complicit. In this climate, the rhetorical escalation toward preemptive thinking becomes not only thinkable, it becomes politically advantageous. The loudest advocates of this shift are concentrated in Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, and certain Northern European and British political factions. Their geographic proximity to Russia feeds an existential narrative, one in which the West is perpetually on the brink of losing the initiative. Their domestic constituencies reward governments that appear defiant, uncompromising, and militarily assertive. As a result, these states project disproportionate influence over NATO's public messaging. Their voices ring louder not simply because they speak forcefully, but because Western Europe seldom challenges them directly. In Berlin, Paris, Madrid, and Rome, policymakers observe the trend with unease. They understand that a doctrine of preemption, even rhetorically, risks accelerating a cycle of fear and counter-fear. Yet their caution rarely becomes public defiance. Western European governments are hesitant to fracture alliance unity, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Their silence is not agreement, but restraint. And restraint in politics often disappears in the noise of louder actors. Thus, hawkish rhetoric becomes normalized by default rather than consensus. Parallel to these political dynamics lies the quieter influence of institutional logic. NATO, like all large bureaucracies, has its own gravitational pull. Military structures expand through expanded missions. Threat perceptions, once stated publicly, justify larger budgets, new operational mandates, and broader intelligence authorities. When an alliance becomes accustomed to acting, it develops incentives to continue acting. Preemptive doctrine, even as rhetoric, widens the operational frontier, granting NATO political and bureaucratic space to grow. This is not conspiracy, it is institutional behavior. All of this takes place within a broader psychological environment shaped by uncertainty. Europeans feel that the post-Cold War era of predictability is slipping away. Energy crises, economic fragmentation, technological vulnerabilities, and geopolitical realignment have combined to create a continent that senses the ground shifting beneath it. In such an atmosphere, governments grasp for tools that project control. Preemptive rhetoric framed as risk management becomes a comforting illusion of mastery over events that increasingly escape control. Thus, NATO's public flirtation with preemption is not a sign of strategic confidence. It is the manifestation of a political ecosystem struggling to stabilize itself. Beneath the bravado lies a deeper emotion, fear disguised as resolve. To grasp the enormity of NATO's preemptive rhetoric, one must confront the military reality that lies beneath the political theater. On the surface, NATO appears overwhelmingly superior. It commands far greater economic output, advanced air power, precision-guided munitions, global intelligence networks, and a vast industrial base capable of sustaining conflict for years. The United States alone can observe Russian troop movements in near real time through its unmatched ISR constellation. European air forces, uneven though they are, collectively dwarf Russia's tactical aviation when fully mobilized. It is the statistical dominance that tempts some strategists into believing that a decisive, anticipatory strike might be both feasible and stabilizing. But war is not fought on spreadsheets, and reality, when traced onto the map of Europe, tells a different story, one where geography punishes overconfidence and doctrine erases illusions of control. Russia's military forces are concentrated near their western border, positioned within rapid strike range of NATO's most vulnerable members. NATO's forces, by contrast, are dispersed across an entire continent and beyond. To concentrate them requires time Russia would instantly recognize. The very act of preparing for a preemptive operation would alert Moscow, eliminating the element of surprise that such an operation requires to succeed. Moreover, Russia has spent decades constructing a defensive architecture of formidable depth, layered air defense networks, fortified hardened facilities, and a dense electronic warfare shield capable of degrading NATO precision systems. S-400 and S-500 batteries, supported by radar and jamming complexes, create zones of denial that would make any initial NATO strike slow, risky, and uncertain. A quick disabling blow is an illusion. The first wave would encounter a wall of steel and radiation. But even this pale before the existential factor, the nuclear dimension. Russia maintains the world's largest stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons, hundreds positioned within reach of any advancing NATO formation. Its military doctrine explicitly permits early nuclear use when the state faces a severe conventional threat. A NATO strike aimed at Russian command nodes, radar systems, or missile batteries could be interpreted not as deterrence, but as preparation for decapitation. Under such conditions, Russian leaders would feel immense pressure to escalate before losing the capacity to do so. The belief that such a conflict could remain limited is not merely optimistic, it is profoundly dangerous. Complicating this further is the cyber frontier, an invisible layer of escalation where both sides possess tools capable of shutting down power grids, disabling financial networks, and interrupting transportation arteries. In any real conflict, these capabilities would be deployed immediately and massively. The distinction between military and civilian domains would collapse overnight. A preemptive strike would not simply target missile silos or air bases. It would plunge societies into systemic paralysis. Thus, while NATO's conventional advantages are undeniable, they do not translate into a safe or controlled framework for first strike thinking. The military balance is far more complex, fragile, and interdependent than the simplistic narrative of superiority suggests. A preemptive strike against a nuclear peer is not a strategy, it is a gamble with civilization. NATO's rhetoric may gesture towards strength, but the military reality it faces demands humility. The battlefield of the 21st century, saturated with nuclear triggers, cyber vulnerabilities, and compressed decision time, does not reward unilateral boldness. It punishes it. If NATO's shift toward preemptive rhetoric reflects a continent's deepening anxiety, Russia's response emerges from an equally powerful force: historical memory, sharpened by geopolitical vulnerability. No nation in modern history has suffered more from invasions across its western frontier than Russia. Napoleon in 1812, Hitler in 1941, and the eastward expansion of NATO after 1991 have carved a permanent wound into the Russian strategic psyche. It is through this lens that Moscow interprets every Western doctrinal shift, including the December 2025 suggestion that a preemptive strike could be reclassified as defense. To Western audiences, this may sound like an academic or rhetorical evolution. To Russia, It is evidence of something far more ominous, the normalization of first strike logic against the Russian state. The immediate reaction, therefore, would be political and diplomatic. Russia would seize upon the admiral's statement as proof that NATO has abandoned its defensive mandate. In the UN Security Council and increasingly influential forums like BRICS Plus, Russian diplomats would argue that it is NATO, not Moscow, that is lowering the global threshold for war. By framing themselves as the aggrieved party, Russian officials would seek to erode Western legitimacy in the eyes of the global South, where skepticism of NATO interventions remains high. But Russia's response would not end with rhetoric. It would rapidly translate into concrete military action. Moscow would increase readiness across the Western military district, repositioning forces closer to potential flashpoints. Dual-capable missile systems, Iskander, Kinzhal, coastal defense batteries would be deployed near NATO borders under the justification of defensive necessity. Submarine patrols in the Arctic and North Atlantic would intensify, ensuring the survivability of Russia's second strike nuclear capability. Each step would be framed not as escalation, but as a forced response to Western aggression. Simultaneously, Russia would accelerate the creation of a parallel Eurasian security ecosystem. Deeper military partnerships with China, Iran, and even North Korea would follow. Joint exercises would expand, intelligence sharing would deepen, and arms cooperation would widen. Moscow would present this as a collective defense against Western destabilization, a narrative that resonates in a world increasingly tired of Western moral exceptionalism. Perhaps the most subtle yet dangerous domain of Russian retaliation would be cyberspace. Moscow would intensify probing operations across Western critical infrastructure, energy grids, banking networks, transportation corridors, signaling that any attempt by NATO to impose escalation dominance would be met with asymmetrical, deniable, and destabilizing counterstrikes. This dynamic produces a deadly feedback loop. NATO hardens its rhetoric to project resolve. Russia hardens its posture in response to perceived threats. Each side claims it is acting defensively. Each side believes it is responding to the other's escalation. Yet the cumulative effect is an environment where misinterpretation, not intent, may trigger catastrophe. Russia's response, then, is not simply reactive. It is structural. It reflects a security dilemma in which every action by one side deepens the insecurity of the other. In this spiral, fear is mirrored back across continents and alliances, amplifying instability with every turn. The most troubling consequence of NATO's preemptive turn lies not in military calculations, nor in the diplomatic maneuvers it provokes, but in the erosion of the moral architecture that has sustained global stability since 1945. For nearly 8 decades, the world has relied on a fragile but essential principle: force may only be used in response to clear aggression. It is this principle, not weapons, not alliances, that held nuclear catastrophe at bay. The moment preemption is reclassified as defense, that structure begins to fracture. The crisis we now face is not merely strategic, it is civilizational. NATO argues that hybrid threats blur conventional red lines, justifying anticipatory action. Russia, interpreting this rhetoric through its own historical fears, concludes that the West is edging toward doctrinal legitimacy for decapitation strikes. Each side claims the moral high ground. Each insists its posture is defensive. Yet every step taken in the name of self-protection deepens the insecurity of the other. This is the classic security dilemma, except now the stakes are nuclear and the feedback loop is tightening. In such an environment, decision time shrinks dramatically. Leaders operate within compressed warning windows where misinterpretation can carry the same weight as intent. A satellite glitch, a cyber false flag, a misread radar signal, any of these could be framed as an imminent first strike. Preemptive rhetoric further accelerates this dynamic, encouraging military planners to consider rapid response as necessity rather than madness. Civilization cannot tolerate a system that rewards instantaneous reaction and punishes reflection. Even more alarming is the precedent NATO's language sets for the rest of the world. If preemption becomes an acceptable interpretation of self-defense, every regional power will claim the same right. China may invoke it over Taiwan. India and Pakistan may cite it across Kashmir. Iran and Israel, Turkey and the Kurds, Ethiopia and Eritrea, each could justify striking first as an act of prudence. The boundary between threat perception and legitimate defense collapses. Preventive war becomes normal. And in a world armed with hypersonic weapons, tactical nuclear arsenals, and destabilizing cyber tools, normalization of preemption becomes nothing less than an invitation to disaster. The tragedy is that alternatives exist, but they require political courage rather than rhetorical bravado. Even more alarming is the precedent NATO's language sets for the rest of the world. If preemption becomes an acceptable interpretation of self-defense, every regional power will claim the same right. China may invoke it over Taiwan. India and Pakistan may cite it across Kashmir. Iran and Israel, Turkey and the Kurds, Ethiopia and Eritrea, each could justify striking first as an act of prudence. The boundary between threat perception and legitimate defense collapses. Preventive war becomes normal. And in a world armed with hypersonic weapons, tactical nuclear arsenals, and destabilizing cyber tools, normalization of preemption becomes nothing less than an invitation to disaster. The tragedy is that alternatives exist, but they require political courage rather than rhetorical bravado. A more stable order demands renewed commitments to non-first-use principles, a revival of arms control frameworks dismantled over the past decade, and a serious dialogue on rules governing cyber and hybrid operations. None of this offers immediate political gain. None produces headlines. But stability is not built through spectacle. It is built through predictability. Predictability is the currency of peace. And Europe, once the champion of diplomatic reason, now finds itself seduced by doctrines that promise security while delivering the opposite. Thus, NATO's flirtation with preemptive logic is not a symbol of strategic clarity. It is a symptom of a deeper malaise, a continent struggling to navigate a world it no longer understands, reaching instinctively for tools that give the illusion of control. But illusions do not protect civilizations. Norms do. Dialogue does. Prudence does. And in a nuclearized world where the margin for error has become perilously thin, the greatest act of strength is not to strike first, but to step back before the world steps over the edge.